My name's David Hall. I'm one of the trustee directors here at Bronzy, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's talk. Thank you for coming, especially as the weather forecast is so dire. Anyway, here at the institution, we're really proud to have been in existence for 200 years, and that wasn't all plain sailing. So tonight we're going to hear about a piece of the fabric of Bath that's been around for 850 years. I wonder what sort of challenges we're going to be hearing about. I'm very pleased to say that tonight we have two speakers. One is Carole Laverick, who is not only at the staff at the foundation, but is also a real enthusiast for the history. And she's going to be covering the first 800 years. And then taking over from her will be David Hobdey, who's the chief executive, and he's going to cover the most recent history and do a bit of crystal ball gazing as well. So can I welcome Carole to start us off? Thanks very much.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you. I work at St. John's and I've been there for 3 years. I work on reception and administration. I'm a very nosy, sort of curious person when it comes to history, but I have no historical qualifications. I've got some hysterical ones, but no historical ones. I have a curiosity and a passion about the stories about us and the life around us. Let's start with the fact that we've been around for quite a while, 850 years. So some of the story will have to be condensed, because otherwise we could be here for quite some time, to try and cover the major things that have affected the charity. How we started as a simple almshouse to housing today over 100 residents in almshouses. We are a significant landowner, and we host two very important programs, the Foundation and Crisis program, that help those that are underserved in Bath to make their lives better for good. And we stand today as one of the longest standing charities in England. David will be talking on the current deliveries and where it's going to go into the future decades and centuries. Obviously, we won't be around to make sure that this comes to fruition, but we hope future generations will continue the responsibility for those in Bath. So, moving on. So how did it all start? Reginald Fitzjocelyn is thought to have been a Frenchman of noble birth. He was born around 1142 to a lady from the Maurienne family. And Reginald often visited Saint-Jean de Maurienne on the old route between France and Italy. This family relationship would connect him with the House of Burgundy and the Emperor Henry VI, as well as Louis VII of France. It was the church's duty to provide aid and sanctuary, and Reginald was the Bishop of Bath. The bishop made a grant of land to the Hospital of the Baths, where our office still stands today, which officially founded St. John's Hospital. It was a hospital in the medieval sense of the word of hospitality. But we do continue to this day get calls to try and sell us X-ray machines and hospital supplies, as you can imagine. Without the religious motivations, St. John's might not have been founded. We are a charity that has 2 churches as part of our portfolio. The life within the almshouses would have been very monastic in nature. It was led by 3 main rules: piety, sobriety, and propriety. All of these were challenged in future decades. There was a lot of prayer, reading, taking care of the sick, manual tasks, strict schedules, and no leisure. For instance, you could take the bath waters for curative reasons, but you couldn't take them for pleasure of bathing. It was a time of the Crusades, and Thomas Becket was assassinated. This is only relevant to this story because Bishop Fitzreginald had to affirm at his ordination that he had nothing to do with the assassination. They were not best placed friends, that's for sure. Here we have a map of Bath in 1174, and it looks so tiny. Bath looks so small. And I love the fact that you can still see the South, oh, actually it hasn't come out very well, but you can actually see Southgate at the bottom, which is obviously why the shopping centre is called Southgate. And St. John's has been on the same site for 850 years in some form or another. The choosing of the site right next to the cross baths is very symbolic. It's so close to the water, and the connection with health and healing was very important. St. John's, the choice of the name, the baptism in water, the hub of the city, and the evidence of those in need all around was evident to Reginald. From the beginning, the almshouses were available to both men and women equally until the 14th century. And then for some reason, for the next few centuries, it was only men that were allowed to stay in the almshouses. I don't know why this is, and I can't find any information as to why that would have changed. This is a picture of the church up at Holloway. And the English Church Council decreed that lepers should not live with the healthy. So when this house was donated in 1088, it was the perfect location outside of the city walls to keep the lepers away from society, but on a main thoroughfare through to the city so that they could beg for alms, alms being a means of funding their lives. This would have been one of the very first leper houses in the country. It was also used in centuries later for lunatics, so named after the belief that the lunar changing cycles affected people. So we have almshouses and a lunatic asylum. But the lepers were there until 1660, and 1660 until the early 20th century, the house and church were used for the mentally ill. 1285, we're leaping ahead. Obviously, these photos do not relate to 1285, but the deeds of St. Michael's Within, the city centre chapel, were mentioned in this year, detailing a west tower, but no churchyard. But we know that there were bodies buried in and around the site in these early years. These photos, obviously much later, but the church clock is very important because it was 300 years later. It originated in 1580 and was one of the earliest public clocks in Bath, and it had a great importance. It was the time in the world of the Crusades. King Edward Longshanks was a warrior king who took on fights with Wales and their desire for independence, and then Scotland, which included the legendary fight with William Wallace, Braveheart, who he executed. So this is just a street view from the exterior of the city chapel, St. Michael's Within, and the stained glass, the modern stained glass that's within the chapel. Obviously, it was within the city walls, as opposed to St. Michael's Without, which is the church which is opposite Waitrose, which was obviously outside of the city walls at the time. The stained glass windows that we have in our chapel were these ones that were a modern replacement for the ones that were lost in World War II, where the church was taken down on one side, the windows were taken down and kept for safety. However, they got stolen, so it wasn't very safe. Sounds like me putting something away for safety and forgetting about it. Some of the glass, the original glass, has remained, and obviously, please, the chapel is open. You're welcome to go into the chapel at any time and have a look at the glass. The Black Death. This is quite a phenomenal event that happened within the world to wipe out 1/3 of the world's population. What we have just experienced with COVID is horrific, but it's nothing on the scale of what happened in 1347. It would have been a century of war and abject poverty, poor health, bereavement, loss, fear, confusion, ignorance. The concept of losing 33% of the world's population is hard. The COVID pandemic, which took 7 million people worldwide, accounts for 0.085% of the population. Doesn't make it any better for the people that were lost in COVID, but just the scale of what happened with the Black Death is phenomenal. And so we move on to 1444, and this image is of St. Catherine's almshouse. It was built as an almshouse, but in a different site originally. It's now where the Gainsborough is sited. The inmates from here traditionally wore black gowns, and it was known as the Black Almshouse because of this. Chapel courtyard was known as the Blue Almshouse because they wore blue gowns. The residents here were known as inmates, which reflects the stricter way of life. So in 300 years, not a lot has changed from the strict rules that Reginald put down for the almshouse residents. St. Catherine's was demolished and rebuilt as an almshouse in 1825. So this is the building that was done then in its current location. It's now part of St. John's Trading Company, and I was explaining to somebody earlier, all the profits go into St. John's Foundation Fund, and it all helps fund the projects that David will speak about later. But you can actually stay in St. Catherine's Almshouse as a guest in Bath, which is lovely. Jumping ahead to Henry VIII, who had a massive impact on not just Bath, not just St. John's, but as a religious figure himself, and choosing to just move away completely from Catholicism and decide that actually I want to marry Anne Boleyn, therefore I want to get away from Catholicism, I'm going to create a new church. And obviously he put himself as leader of the church, and this tradition has remained so to today. But St. John's Hospital evaded confiscation of land and wealth by appointing a non-clerical master. So he wasn't a teacher, he wasn't a priest, but he was a master. However, most of the masters tended to be reverends of some type. This is hugely important time for St. John's to avoid the dissolution of the monasteries and losing everything that they had built up and all of the work that they had done. By the 1540s, Bath was accounted as a ruined city. The cloth trade had moved out into the country and the priory was gone with its income. The Bimbury area, which is very close, is where St. Catherine's and Belot's is based, seems to have reached a low ebb, and the corporation was granted the patronage of St. John's Hospital in 1572, and it became completely, in 1580, the hospital precinct was completely rebuilt and enlarged, funded by a national collection. I'd love to know how that worked. To provide lodgings for private visitors to the baths, as well as better accommodation for the poor. So at this point, the population, it took 400 years for the population to double, which is quite important. Here we have an etching of Belot's Hospital. This came about because Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn had a daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, and she and Lord Burghley visited Bath. They both really enjoyed their visit. Lord Burghley died, and his estate was handled by his steward, Thomas Belot. I do love this story because it's so funny that actually everything is named after Belot rather than Lord Burghley. He created Belot's Hospital for the poor with the funds from Lord Burghley's estate. This was a true hospital for the sick. He was also a major contributor to the Abbey restoration and the floor, and I believe there's a poem written about his magnificence and, wonderfulness. It was a belief at this time to care for the poor. If you had grain in your store, you should share it. And this was very much an Elizabethan theme of making sure you're looking after people. For fear of revolution, and talking of revolution, we have the gunpowder plot. It was discovered with the Catholic associates of Guy Fawkes attempting to blow up the king. The irony that the English Catholics were trying to seek help and assistance from the European Catholics, who were in the middle of their own inquisition and persecution of non-Catholics, is not lost on me. That each country was hunting down non-believers and exterminating them, it was dependent on which country you were born in, and to say whether you were in the right or in the wrong. And what was happening in Bath? Bath was attracting prominent visitors and influential doctors, and the district was evidently now an important part of the spa. Alterations and improvements took place from time to time in the baths, and the area appears to have entered on a period of prosperity, as in the hearth tax in 1664, the largest number of hearths for one entry was William Ireland's holding by the hot baths, which was 17, which is quite incredible. This is a very basic drawing of the buildings before the Georgian era. It was a time of Oliver Cromwell and lots of political things going on with Stuart restorations and Cromwell really hating the Catholics and the Irish. I mean, killing a king, executing a king, naming himself the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, a very tumultuous time. However, when he died and his son took over, it only lasted 2 more years, and then the Stuarts were restored to the crown. When they came back, Cromwell's head was placed on a spike outside the Tower of London, where it stayed for 30 years. That's not nice. So we have the Duke of Chandos, and I know we have an expert here on the Duke of Chandos, and it isn't me. So I'm going to apologise before I even go into this. But this is probably one of the most famous and known periods of Bath history, the Georgian era, with the master plan of John Wood and his eye for detail and symbolism. The London set would come to Bath to take the waters and the social life, which was not quite so regimented in Bath as it was in London. Here, colourful characters like mainly Beau Nash, but we also had characters like Ralph Allen and John Wood, who would lead the societal rules and ensure that almost socialist ruling of equality was maintained in social circumstances. This led to interactions between classes which would never have been considered acceptable in London. The Duke was a hugely successful man with money, mainly in the plantations, but he wanted to diversify his fortune, so took to property development in Bath. He bought up quite a few parcels of land in the Crossbaths and Bimbury area to later knock down and redevelop. He also purchased leaseholds for the area of the chapel courtyard of St. John's, which he piecemeal developed with John Wood the Elder. These leases then would revert back to what we were called then the masters, co-brethren and sisters of the Hospital of St. John's the Baptist. So I have brought some deeds with me, and they are at the back. The indentures and everything are at the back of Chandos, buying up these leases from different characters. Please do have a look. When the Duke and Duchess first came to Bath, they stayed in Chapel Court. The ground floor of the almshouses were for a few elderly, poor residents, and the floors above had been privatised and now contained lodging houses operated by one Anne Phillips. It became the nucleus of a complex of houses that Chandos proposed to build around a central courtyard, which is what you see today. The Duke was a very hard man to please, and he wanted somebody young and cheap to do the work. The Duke and John Wood the Elder might have been introduced to each other through a London neighbour, Lord Bingley. I swear this sounds more like a Jane Austen novel by the minute, who knew and had employed John Wood to work on his Yorkshire estate in Bramham. It was in Yorkshire that John Wood first drew up his ultimate designs for Bath. There does seem to be a bit of a theme with John Wood having difficulties with his patrons. However, it didn't deter either him or Chandos, as John Wood not only refurbished the almshouses, which was also his first ever private building in Bath, it was vastly over budget, and John Wood had been put under arrest as he'd not paid off all his workers until Chandos intervened. The relationship could be described as a little bit problematic. These are the maps. I'm not sure how clear they are, but on the left-hand side, we've got the names on the left-hand side of the leaseholders before it was developed. We've got Anne Phillips, which is the lady I just mentioned before, with her lodging house. John Billing, and that's the indenture that I've got open on the desk at the back. The Escorts, Walter Chivers and Mrs. Jones's house, and the gardens and everything as well. So they're very, very different from how it is developed, but that is exactly how it looks now, the one on the right. Here we are, centuries after Henry VIII, and we're still fighting over Catholic and Protestant. And in Bath, in London, in 1780, Lord George tried to get the 1778 Act repealed for giving Catholics some basic rights. He didn't want that to happen. And in Bath, the anti-Catholic rioting erupted. They burnt down the Catholic chapel in St. James's Parade. The city of Bath responded strongly, hanging the ringleader, and a tax was levied to the city to pay for the damages, and a new, less conspicuous Catholic chapel was built as a result of this. Here's the outside of John Wood's house. which again, as you walk through the courtyard in Chapel Courtyard, you can see this beautiful stonework, which is stunning. So John Wood, his construction ran right over budget. He was supposed to be about 1,600. It ended up being 3,100. We laugh at this now. But his inexperience and cutting of corners meant there were difficulties with the building from inception. So the pipes from the water closets were not lead as expected. They were merely wooden boards nailed together. Chandos was so well acquainted with plumbing and carpentry that he was furious. It did not deter Chandos from employing Wood on 2 more lodging houses in the future. And in 1734, he agreed to be godfather to Wood's daughter, so all was not lost. For all of Chandos's hectoring and badgering, and I should imagine he was a very, very hard patron to please, Wood learnt so much from him. It was a time of the Industrial Revolution. It was a world of revolution. Americans fighting for independence from the British and the French Revolution against their monarchy. So I should imagine very challenging times. We have one of the plaques in the courtyard as well for Horace Walpole, who was the son of the British Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. He himself was a politician and an author, and he coined the phrase serendipity in one of his novels. It shows that the almshouses were used for a multitude of uses, including an early version of an Airbnb, leaving the top rooms to be used as guest rooms, which funded the inmates to the lower levels. Bath was a really fashionable set with Bonash, setting the court standards, and very much a place for the escaping monarchy from Europe to come and seek refuge. It might be considered serendipity that the Charityy has survived all of these historical changes and still continues to change lives for the better, for good. The French Revolution and the abolishment of the monarchy and the beginning of a new socialist era in Europe, which the British were terrified of, also affected our world in Bath. Chandos Arms is, I have got it up, yes. It's been a private residence for the Duke of Chandos. It's been a public house for 138 years, and you can still see the access for the barrels to be rolled down to the basement through the gardens. So if you stand by Sports Direct and look over, you can see the rolling line for where the barrels go through to the basement. Chandos Arms used to produce its own whiskey, Chandos whiskey originally named, used by the Salvation Army, not the whiskey. Sorry, that was probably not at the same time. It's been used as a registry office, and it's now converted into 7 beautiful independent flats. This is the census from, I know it says 1841, but it's actually 1851. That was my error, sorry. I was always under the impression that our almshouses were for the elderly people until I discovered, thanks to a visitor who came to reception, that this is not the case at all. This census information shows us in 1851 that 228 people lived in just Chapel Court alone, and the average age was 31. It was filled with families and intergenerational living. The courtyard would have been noisy with children and life in general. The range of the residents were from paupers, and they would actually put paupers down as their profession. There were solicitors, clerks, widows, birdcage maker to bookmakers. It was life at its most extreme. Life would have been everywhere, skipping in the courtyard, laughter, tears, the aromas of cooking pots everywhere, and maybe some dodgy pipework smells as well. Now we have only 25 residents living in this courtyard. So all the census information I found today is printed off with the families of 7 members being quite a standard number. But in 1881 and in 1891, there were 2 families with 10 members in each family, basically in 2 or 3 rooms. The Davis family in 1881 ranged from 55 years to 6 years old, and there were 10 of them. And the Lane family in 1891 were from 37 years old to 6 months old. There were 10 of them. I can't get my head around that. And around this time, the Spanish Inquisition stopped. So 1890, Chapel House is a brothel. So going back into the far reaches of the Charity's inception, Bishop Reginald FitzJocelyn asking his inmates to follow 3 simple rules: sobriety, piety, and propriety. Somehow in the late 1800s, everything had gone a bit wrong. Chandos House was the Chandos Arms. Chapel House was used as a brothel. In 1890, there was a massive clear out and refurbishment of the site. And also around this time, in 1863, the first part of the London Underground was opened, which I think is quite incredible. I can't get my head around that. So at the time that Chapel House is being cleared out, this is the master on the left-hand side who was in charge of St. John's just after this had happened. So Reverend Robert Whittington was master between 1892 and 1899. It was his son, Robert Hugh, who had no children, who lived and died at 1 Queen Square. He left it to the Whittington sisters, who were distant relatives. They had no children either. He gave it to them in 1942. When they passed, no, they were still living. They gave it to St. John's Hospital as a gift in 1953, and the last Whittington sister didn't die until, I think it was 1972. So it was a great gift to be given this house. The master, Robert Whittington, was a relative to the infamous Dick Whittington, Lord Mayor of London in the 1500s. He was a man who believed in philanthropy, and even though he was born to wealth, he was the second born and so had to earn a living. He had an awareness of the discrepancy in living standards of those living in poverty and those in wealth. In his will, he again had no children. He built an almshouse and also put a massive investment into clean water in the East End of London. Philanthropy, kindness, and consideration. Could there be a genetic link with all of these Whittingtons who have given so much to our charity? So the Chandos Arms closes down in 1914. And in 1938, Time magazine declares Adolf Hitler as Man of the Year. I don't know what to say about that. Moving on, and there is a link, you'll see that link, eh? So World War II, it led to a period of change within Bath and rebuilding for obvious reasons. It wasn't until the mid-1950s that our refurbishments were undertaken. And this is from the Bath Blitz, and it shows how close the bombs actually were to St. John's. This is some of the damage. Again, this is taken from Bath Blitz. So Magdalen Chapel on the Holloway was very badly damaged, as you can see in the Baedeker raids in 1942, as was Abbey House, which is right next door to the almshouses. We did have some damage to Chapel House, and we were extremely lucky not to take a direct hit. We touched on this a minute ago, that one Queen Square was donated to St. John's Foundation by the Whittington family. Lovely synchronicity that Queen Square was also designed by John Wood the Elder in 1730, just a few years after he'd constructed Chapel Courtyard. He'd learned a lot. As mentioned before, John Wood loved symbolism. He loved paganism and nature. And seeing here, you can see number C is the half moon of the Royal Crescent. You can see the circular sun at the circus and the symbolism of the square for the earth in Queen Square. Can you also see that it looks like a key, and it looks like the key of knowledge or unlocking knowledge? And this is very relevant to St. John's Foundation and something that David will talk about in a minute. We're nearly there. You've done so well. Although John Wood was not a mason, he was intrigued by their symbols and he used them repeatedly in his designs. He built Queen Square first, then he started the circus, and he had planned and drawn the Royal Crescent, but it was John Wood the Younger, or as the Americans love to call him, Junior, who finished these detailed plans. Right, last one from me. Bath delights in its Georgian architecture, and for many, it's an excuse to revisit a different time, a simpler time. Films continue to be made in the idyllic backdrop of Georgian Bath. the buildings that John Wood the elder inspired and his son, John Wood the younger, I was nearly going to say junior, continued. This is really not an excuse just to put up a beautiful picture. It is a very, very important part to Bath's history and to its finances. I'm going to hand you over to David now to do the serious business of where we are going next and how we are delivering to those that are underserved in Bath for the future. Thank you.
So yes, we're almost into modern times. And the 1970s. So we have, as well as providing refuge and hospitality for people in need, I suspect we have, throughout most of our history, also given small amounts of money to people in need. And it was probably about this time that we started to provide grants to individuals in crisis, and that program began to be formalized. At its heart, we've always been an almshouse charity, and we still do, and always will, provide good quality, comfortable and safe sheltered housing for older adults. We also provide outreach support for non-resident older adults that live in Bath and North East Somerset. We provide activities to help them avoid isolation. Other events, we provide them with advice, signpost them to where they can get good advice to help them live positive lives. And of course, that applies to our residents as well as our non-residents too. But as I say, we have long been a provider of grants. And it was about this time that our trustees began to realize that we'd benefited over the years from all sorts of major legacies. We'd built up our investments, and it was right to start being as generous as we possibly could. And that's what inspired a little bit of a move away from almshouses on their own. So in 1974 or thereabouts, we were bequeathed Rosenberg House, which sits just to the north of Chapel Court, roughly opposite Tesco Express, I think, on Westgate Buildings. It didn't look like that then, but it's noteworthy that we would have built up our wealth from major bequests like that, and One Queen Square is a great example of that as well. In modern day times, we tend not to get such big legacies, which of course tend to go more to charities that are much more reliant on fundraising for what they do. We tend to live off our investments. But it comes back to this point of wanting to make sure that we maximize the charitable delivery that we could achieve from our wealth. And we modernized Rosenberg House for use by almshouses. Again, not quite to that extent in the 1970s, but it was the start of us being aware of the need to start looking after our older population. And I think it's really useful that Carole has peppered the slides with information about growth of our population. So by 1974, we've got a world population of 4 billion. In less than a decade, so by 1999, it had grown by another 2 billion. And that's part of what's putting pressure on the age of our population and creating that need to continue to improve care for older adults. We also acknowledge the growth in technology, of course, and that things like Microsoft being founded in 1975. That doesn't seem like a very long time ago for such a huge technology company. And of course, all of that comes with improvements in healthcare, and that creates that additional need to look after the older population. Again, more example of us recognizing the importance of expanding our almshouse stock. And in 2003, we saw the opening of a brand new purpose-built complex of almshouses, which is by the cricket ground near the RUH on Coombe Park. The Coombe Park Almshouse, of course, had been opened by His Royal Highness Prince of Wales. His now wife became patron of St. John's in 2009, something that we were very pleased about. And of course, she joined us at our recent celebrations on the 1st of February to help us celebrate our 850th anniversary. And we very much welcome her patronage, because it does so much to help us raise our profile, but much more importantly, to raise the awareness of why we do the work that we do and the need that we address. Queen Camilla is very interested in charities that support older adults. But she also is, she's very keen on charities that support disadvantaged children, that support education for children. And of course, that started to become a very important part of what we do. She has also many other interests. She is particularly keen on charities that support domestic abuse, and that's actually quite closely related to some of the challenges of inequality that we address. So over the last decade, I think we have really tried to, as I said, coming back to this point, that it's really important that we maximize the amount of money that we can invest into charitable delivery. And we've begun to modernize the way that the organization works. So that includes rebalancing our investment portfolio. So for many, many years, we've been a charity that's been associated in some way with the heritage of Bath, dare I say, even preserving the heritage of Bath. But that is not our purpose as a charity. Our purpose is to change lives, is to help people. And increasingly, we have made sure that our focus is right in that respect. One of the ways in which we modernize has to be about making sure we maximize the return from our investments, and that's why we rebalance our portfolio. One of the ways in which we have been pushing the barriers is about increasing the stock of our almshouses, as I have mentioned. We have also recognized that we need to, whilst almshouses and looking after old adults will always be at the core, we also need to respond to the need that exists in our community. And that is why in 2020, by that time, we had long developed that initial grant giving activity that had started back in the 1970s. We had long begun to develop that into supporting lots of other charities that help people. But in very early 2020, we decided to focus that grant giving activity even more. And we were very struck at that stage by the huge disadvantage that exists between people living in low-income backgrounds and those who were better off in Bath. We were shocked to discover that, in fact, in Bath and North East Somerset, we have one of the biggest gaps in the educational attainment of children who come from a lower income background compared to those who are better off. And that is a major driver of life chances. And I'll come back to that in a second. In the meantime, going back to the modernization, the sophistication of the way in which we invest, we took 1 Queen Square, which had been bequeathed to us back in the 1950s and had been let as part of our portfolio of investment properties. We took that back into our own use. We renovated it, and it is now just across the square. Of course, it is now available as state-of-the-art, very beautiful co-working and serviced office space, providing working accommodation that is very much fit for the future and there to help support businesses in Bath. It is also a means of us being able to showcase to some extent what the charity does. So this this sits in our trading company. So the idea of having a trading company, and we've got St. Catherine's in there as well, as Carole mentioned, it's about taking a little bit more risk on a part of our investment, but also another way in which we can help increase the amount of money that we can invest into charitable purpose. So we really do come up to the present day, and we have by this stage modernized the way that we look after our assets, the way that we are much more commercial in the way that we target returns. We stand shoulder to shoulder with other businesses in the city in that we run a trading company. And whilst almshouses and looking after older adults will always be at the heart of what we do, we are very concerned, as I say, to make sure that we address key areas of need in the region. I've talked about the educational and the attainment gap, and the embarrassment almost of that to a population like Bath and North East Somerset, which is relatively affluent. In the academic year 22 to 23, for example, children who are entitled to free school meals had the worst educational outcomes in that cohort in the country. And I think that's embarrassing for a region, as I said, and that applied at ages 5, 11, and 7. And that means that, going back to that point I made, that your life chances are lower if you with poor educational attainment. So if you come from a low income background in Bath and North East Somerset, then your life chances are likely to be much worse than if you come from anywhere else in the country, and that cannot be right. And we will continue to respond to that kind of need. So we are working with a range of delivery partners and with the council in particular, so that we can influence what is happening in seven primary schools in particular in Bath and North East Somerset, where there are high proportions of children who are entitled to free school meals. And in the same catchment areas, we're working with early year settings. And we're helping children there with speech and language. And in primary schools, we're also helping with speech and language, with additional support for maths, for reading, for writing, and also providing additional help for children who need further support in developing their emotional and behavioral needs. And although we are relatively early into that work, the results over the first 2 years are showing that, especially in early years children and at key stage 1, which is infant school children, the work we are doing is certainly making a difference to their speech and language capabilities and to their literacy overall. So we're very encouraged by that, and we said when we set out our new strategy in 2020 that we would be prepared to take at least a 10-year view, and we are very hopeful that we can help at least contribute to an improvement in outcomes for children, and therefore for the life chances of people who come from lower income backgrounds. And whilst as a region we have a lower proportion overall of people who live in poverty than others, we are still talking about somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 children who live in poverty in our region, and that's a really important need that we will continue to address. So I think what is most remarkable about our history is our longevity, actually, and that throughout all of that time, throughout all of our 850 years, we have been here to care for people and to make their lives better. And we have been able to adapt to that need, and that's absolutely what we intend to continue doing for the next 850 years. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. That was fascinating. I'm pleased that an 850-year-old veteran can take a 10-year view. I'm sure that a lot of what you're going to be doing will last for a lot longer than that. And I was really interested to see how something that has been around so long and is so much part of the fabric of the city, and indeed owns quite a chunk of the fabric of the city, has been able to adapt and turn its focus in an entirely new direction. And apparently it would appear to be quite a success. And we wish you a lot of luck in the future. What I'd like to do now is throw it open for questions from anybody in the room. And my colleague Paul is looking at the online chat room to see if anybody has any questions to put there. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question? And if I may, I will pass you a microphone so that you can explain your question to the audience online.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, thank you. I mean, very good presentations both, and it's a very intriguing, fascinating institution. I've actually got lots and lots of questions, but the one I'd like to focus on is your new mission. You know, the mission since 2020. I was completely shocked when I was taken to Twerton and shown around by one of the headmasters there, who said, the children who come here have never experienced love or security. They've never learned how to sit down for a meal without a TV there. And having to deal with that and teach them the basics that it was profoundly shocking to me. And I really wonder how we got into that situation. But I think, I've been thinking, what would one do to address that? And I think what you've chosen, I think what you said you've chosen to do is to fund, I suppose, supplementary teaching, supporting teaching, to teach children those skills. I'm really interested. Is that the right thing to do? Are you able to measure those outcomes? And do you think that's going to, over what sort of time frame would you expect what sort of results?
Thank you, William. Shall I use this? Yeah. I mean, so we actually, when we set out in 2020, we decided that we would do 4 things essentially for for working both with the schools and in the community. The first was that we would provide additional support with educational basics. So that's the reading, writing, the numeracy. We said that we would give them help with emotional and behavioral support. We said that we would ensure that children had access to food, nutritious food, both in school and out of school. And we said that they would have safe places. And our work addresses all of those to a lesser or greater extent. And absolutely, we will, our overall ambition is to try and narrow the Key Stage 2 attainment gap. And all of those things touch that. And therefore, during that 10-year period, we will absolutely be measuring both statutory educational outcomes as a result of the things that we're doing with children in schools, in early year settings, as well as additional data that our delivery partners that are doing things like providing extra maths or the emotional support. We will be measuring additional things both qualitatively and quantitatively to measure the impact of what it is that we're doing. Does that deal with all of your question? Yeah. Yeah, I can't answer how we got into that situation. That was my fear that you were going to ask that.
Thank you to you both. I've worked and lived in Bath for 35 years, and I'm really embarrassed about how little about your organisation I know. So thank you for helping plug that gap. Two questions. Can you give me a rough idea of how your activities split, just in crude percentage terms, between almshouses, school stuff and outreach generally?
Yeah.
And secondly, in the almshouses, I'm curious, how do people get to be in one of your almshouses, please?
So I'll take the last question first. So mostly it's through the council's home search facility. So if you're looking for social housing, that is the obvious go to. So we do try and target in the main older adults who are from lower income backgrounds or who have little wealth. So when we know that we usually get a sense of when apartments are going to come up. So that's when we would open the waiting list. We'd invite applications through home search. We would also talk to organisations like Curo. We're quite close to Curo. So and we do have an age threshold. So typically it's 65 and over for the almshouses, but we might alter that for reasons of poor health, things like that. Now, the other question was the rough split. And so in terms of what we spend on the almshouses each year, that's probably somewhere between 55 and 60% of our total expenditure. The rest is on effectively the funding that we use to support all the activities in schools. It also includes our crisis program. So throughout all of our revisions to strategy, we recognise that the crisis funding that we provide usually to individuals directly, and we provide grants up to about £1,200 per person, a little bit more for a couple. That is such a lifeline for so many people that hit financial crisis that we decided to keep the crisis program. For that, we spend about, I would say that must account for about 10% of funding overall. Yeah. Thank you.
Could I just ask you how long approximately would be the waiting time for one of the rooms or flats in the almshouses?
So we tend not to, because we open applications when we've got vacancies, we tend not to keep a long waiting list. We do have people that have passed assessments, because when we've opened applications, a number of people will apply. So for example, it's possible we'll get half a dozen applications when we've got two apartments to fill. And in those cases, people might pass our assessments, and so we would keep them on a waiting list. But it's difficult to state a time as such, because we only open the list when we know that we've got vacancies coming up. Actually, Carole deals with that area definitely. Yes. I've got the expert.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's 3 criteria for the almshouses. You have to be a pensionable age. You have to have some association or with Bath. So it could be that you've lived in Bath or you have family who live in Bath. And the third one is if you have assets or savings less than 37,000. So at the moment, we have got a few properties which are coming up within both sites, and they go through a process. So you send in an application, and yes, David's right, it goes on home search, but quite often we get people just knocking on the door and asking at any time, and we sort of deal with them all the way through the process. And it's not a punitive process. When David talks about an assessment, it is to prioritise every application. So somebody's need might be greater than yours. You might apply at exactly the same time, but that person might be living in a very dangerous situation. They might be living in housing which is deemed to be unsafe for them, or it could be that their mobility has changed. And the whole thing about the almshouses, it's living independently. So it is not a care home. It is, we want you to live a healthy, full and active life for as long as you can. You can have carers come in, but it's all about a community, a family. There are activities put on for exterior people and residents. They all join in. You don't have to. You live there independently. The activities that are put on are there as a choice. You can go down and go and have a community lunch together. You can go to supper club, which I think is my favorite, where a group of people come together. They start at 2 o'clock. They have a cup of tea, talk about what they're cooking for tea. The teacher comes in, she's bought all the ingredients. They all go into the kitchen, cook together and sit down and break bread at 5:30, 6 o'clock. It's a brilliant community. For one of the biggest things that people are fighting is loneliness. And we don't want people to be lonely. They can live independently, but you don't need to be lonely. So it's a wonderful community in the almshouses, I think. Sorry.
It is, yeah. And it's probably worth me saying, actually, one from a strategic point of view, whilst given the aging population and the importance of enabling adults to live well and to live independently for as long as they possibly can, we have recently joined forces with Age UK in Bath, and also with the third sector group 3SG, and we are very much focused on trying to establish Bath and North East Somerset as an age-friendly community. That's a really important strategic goal for us at the moment. That is something which it's a state of affairs which is recognized by the World Health Organization, and essentially an age-friendly community is one in which age should never be a barrier to leading a successful life, and we subscribe to that very strongly.
I think my question's partly been answered. I do know somebody who's trying to get housing, and I know someone else who's wouldn't qualify with you, but lives in a pretty awful bedsit and with mental health problems. So I just sort of feel it could be very stressful on this waiting list, and not being sure of what chances they've got of rehousing. I don't know whether you take that into account.
As I say, we tend not to keep a long waiting list of people. What if they've passed an assessment? Yes, that we will keep them in the background until an apartment comes up. But again, Carole, you probably know better than me in terms of how long some of our people might be waiting.
It really can vary, because as I sort of said, the priorities could change. You could have applied 2 months ago, and yet somebody else has come in and their need is far greater. They may have lost their mobility. They may have 27 steps to get upstairs to their accommodation. The lift never works. All of those things might push you further down a list. So there is no definitive time. And what the team does is literally anyone who's been through the assessment, which is where 2 people from the team come talk to you in your residence, so they can see the difficulties, you know, whether it's social or your sort of like practical. And it's not a judgment, it is just to help them assess where you would be. And they constantly will be phoning up people who are on the accommodation list, and sort of there might be 5. That's all. There might be 5 people on that accommodation list. And if it takes a couple of months to go through, you know, where there's no vacancies, that they would be phoning you and sort of saying, Janet, are you still looking for accommodation? Because we might have something coming up in the next month. We don't promise that we can house everybody that comes through our assessment process. We couldn't. Sadly, we'd love to. And it's so sad, I think, that Bishop Fitzjocelyn, all those decades ago and centuries ago, saw a need for looking after people, and we're still in the same situation 850 years later.
Carole, could I just ask you as well, do you work with other trusts like the Willits Trust or the Guinness Trust when it comes to housing people?
So so we know the Willits Trust very well. In fact, we have or had a trustee in common. I'm not aware that we have a formal relationship with them, but obviously we tend to know most of the charities in Bath, so it's very easy to pick up the phone and to swap ideas and to talk about different cases. And I know occasionally, in fact, I'm aware of one of our residents recently who moved from St John's to actually not to Willits but to Partis College. So again, it's another almshouse charity in the region, and sometimes people's needs are slightly different and they want something slightly different from a different community. So we would try and liaise to some extent. Yeah, but we don't have a formal relationship as such.
This will sound like a political question, but it's actually more of an operational question. And thinking about the work you're doing with the primary schools and also the crisis work that you do, you are inevitably working alongside public sector organisations, the council, academies or schools. And I just wondered, how do you manage that in a kind of practical way in order to, you know, because in both those cases, you're not wanting to add to the administrative burden, you're not wanting to get in the way of things that are, you know, should be done in a particular way, but equally you want to help. So how do you, sort of practically speaking, how do you manage that both in the educational sector and in the kind of welfare sector? Yeah,
so by and large, I would say our relationships are successful in that respect. So particularly in our work with schools, we're very conscious. I mean, schools are such busy places, and you know, teaching staff are stretched. That's so very obvious. So we try hard not to increase the burden, but at the same time, when we set up the programs that we run with them, we involved them so that they own the decision about how we help. So I guess there's definitely a people relationship thing in there which helps deal with that problem. With an organisation like the council, I think they are always very grateful because in essence we're providing extra money for things. So we have a great relationship with children's services, for example, because of the work that we're doing in early years settings. If I'm honest, sometimes one can sense that the council, because we know that times are extremely tough for the council and for funding, and I'm sure it would be easy for them to look to us in some way to perhaps fill a funding gap. You know, we have to be a little bit careful of things like that. But by and large, I think we manage that okay.
You seem to be doing fantastic work with assisting education for children, disadvantaged children. what support is this? Do you put additional staff in the classrooms, or do you provide equipment, or is it out of hours?
Yeah. So it's a mixture of those things. In fact, so we provide additional resources to some extent, which might not be people. So we help acquire established evidence-based schemes. So schemes that help teach maths, schemes that help teach phonics, for example. We provide funding for that. We essentially commission an organization of educational psychologists that deliver programs in schools which help with class-based assessments of the emotional and behavioral needs of children, and some of that provides some of that comprises funding, which means that specialists will work in classrooms with children, and things like that are extremely important for helping children better regulate their emotions, and so help with behavioral issues in class, making children better, more ready to learn. And actually, yes, we also provide a little bit of funding which enables the schools to fund additional staff, particularly to assist with things like reading recovery at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, oh, there's one at the front.
Your income used to be from letting the properties in Bath. Is that still the case? And if so, how much of Bath do you actually own?
We still, our investment portfolio still does consist of a significant amount of property, and it is all property in Bath. So yes, some of our income does come from letting properties. We took the strategic decision a few years ago that there was our portfolio had too much property in it. You know, that's not a balanced portfolio. So over the last few years, we have steadily started to sell some of our property. Our investment portfolio, it's not a secret because you can see it in our accounts, is worth something like 110, 120 million pounds. About 50, when I joined the organisation 8 years ago, over 75% of that was represented by property in Bath. That is now down to roughly 50%. So whilst I think we were officially in the top 4 landowners in Bath, I suspect we're not quite there now.
There are no more questions. I'd like to say thank you very much for a fascinating evening. I'm delighted that part of our heritage is still so relevant today and doing active, good work. I hope the same can be said of this institution too. And I'd like to invite everybody to give a round of applause to express our appreciation. David and Carole. Thank you very much.